Welcome to boring past times, a place where history drifts slowly, like candlelight, across old stone walls. Tonight, we wander through forgotten punishments and rituals of medieval Europe's strange customs, quiet details, and the heavy silence of lives lived long ago. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the past unfold, one uneventful step at a time. Story 1. The Pillory and the Shame of the Square. Imagine yourself standing in the center of a bustling medieval town square. The smell of freshly baked bread drifts from a nearby stall, while the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes faintly. Down a narrow street, market stalls are crowded with farmers selling their produce, cloth merchants displaying bolts of wool and linen, and butchers with their knives gleaming in the sunlight. Amid all this ordinary activity, there is something that instantly draws the eye. A heavy wooden structure set on a raised platform for all to see. This is the pillory, a device of public humiliation, and it was as much a part of medieval life as the church or the marketplace itself. The pillory consisted of a sturdy wooden frame with holes cut for the head and hands. Once a person was locked into place, they could do little but stand uncomfortably exposed to the gazon, often the anger of their neighbors. To us today, the device might seem cruel or even absurd, but in the medieval imagination, it was an effective and necessary part of maintaining order. For many townsfolk, it was not merely a symbol of justice, but also of community life, a place where morality was displayed as publicly as goods in the marketplace. You may imagine punishments as something rare, but in many towns, the pillory was in frequent use. Petty theft, cheating customers in trade, spreading slander, or even selling underweight bread could land someone here. The purpose was not to inflict physical pain, though the posture was far from comfortable, but to inflict shame. It was shame, rather than blood, that was considered a corrective force for everyday misdeeds. For hours or sometimes days the punished would stand helpless, watched by all who passed by. Children might jeer, merchants might throw spoiled vegetables, and gossips might whisper and laugh. Some communities treated it almost like entertainment. The pillory turned the square into a theater where the actor was unwilling, the performance was shame, and the audience was everyone. But this was not only a show. To understand why the pillory mattered, you must picture the medieval town as a tightly woven fabric of interdependence. Every person's role was visible and necessary. Coopers, cobblers, masons, all working within narrow streets where privacy was rare. A lie, a theft, or a betrayal could damage not only one relationship, but the fragile trust that held the whole community together. When someone was punished in the pillory, it reminded everyone of the cost of dishonesty. It also reassured them that order was being maintained. Life around the pillory was not just about the person inside it. The presence of this structure shaped how townspeople thought of morality and justice in daily life. Children grew up watching it, learning early that their actions were never entirely private. Market vendors set their stalls near it, knowing that a crowd would always gather when someone was locked inside. Even festivals sometimes incorporated punishments as part of their events, blurring the line between justice and spectacle. And yet, the scene was not always simple. There were moments when a punished person received sympathy instead of scorn. If the crowd believed the punishment unjust, they might bring food and drink, shielding the accused from humiliation. In some cases, they even turned against the officials who had ordered it. The pillory was meant to enforce authority, but it also gave the community a stage to express its own feelings about justice. What strikes you as you stand in that square is how ordinary it all seems. Justice in the medieval world was not hidden behind courtrooms or prisons. It was open, visible, and woven into the rhythm of daily life. People saw it as they bought bread, as they met friends, as they carried their goods home. Shame was public, because life itself was public. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. The pillory reminds us that punishment was not only about the individual offender, but also about the collective. It spoke of shared values, the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and the community's power to judge its members. To be shamed was, in a way, what to be momentarily cast out from belonging. But here lies the question. In a world so dependent on community ties, what was more painful, the physical discomfort of the pillory, or the deep wound of being seen as an outcast by one's own neighbors? When you picture punishment today, you might imagine prison cells, legal trials, or private correctional systems hidden from daily life. But in the medieval period, punishment was rarely a private affair. It was not about removing someone quietly from the community. It was about making an example of them, displaying their faults for all to see, and using shame as a powerful weapon of control. The pillory was not just a device. It was an instrument for shaping behavior through the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors. At its heart, the pillory was about humiliation. Locked in place, unable to move, the punished person became less than a participant in society and more of an object and exhibit in the theater of justice. To understand why this mattered, we must look at how medieval society valued reputation. In a world where legal documents were few, contracts often verbal, and trust held communities together, reputation was a kind of currency. To lose it was devastating. A baker who cheated a customer by weighing bread too lightly might find himself in the pillory. The punishment was less about the discomfort of standing with head and hands locked in wood, and more about what his neighbors would think the next time he tried to sell them a loaf. Who would trust him now? The shame lingered far longer than the hours he stood exposed. This was the genius and cruelty of humiliation as punishment. Its effects extended into daily life, haunting the offender long after the sentence was over. But humiliation was never passive. Crowds made it active. Onlookers did not just watch. They participated. They jeered, insulted, and sometimes hurled rotten food or mud at the person. In some places, communities even kept a stock of old vegetables specifically for these occasions, as if public ridicule was a ritual they prepared for. If the crowd was particularly hostile, the punishment could turn dangerous. People threw stones, dung, or anything else at hand. In extreme cases, offenders left the pillory not only shamed, but bruised and bloodied. Still, there were rules and spoken ones. A criminal despised for theft might endure cruel torment from passers-by, while someone punished for a less serious or more controversial offense might be treated more gently. Sometimes sympathy grew so strong that the crowd defended the prisoner, offering comfort, food, or even protection from harsher treatment. The community itself became judge and jury, deciding in real time how much humiliation was deserved. The authorities understood this dynamic well. The pillory was a stage upon which the drama of power played out. When the local lord, magistrate, or town council ordered someone locked in place, it was a reminder of their control over moral order. Yet, if the crowd turned against the punishment, that same act could undermine the authority it was meant to enforce. This delicate balance meant that the pillory was not just a punishment, but also a test of how aligned the community felt with its rulers. Humiliation was also carefully calibrated. Authorities used the pillory for crimes considered disruptive to daily life but not serious enough to warrant execution or mutilation. This middle ground included cheating, lying, slander, or petty theft. By punishing publicly but not fatally, rulers reinforced order without destroying the very workforce that the town depended upon. A man needed to be taught a lesson, but he also needed to return to his craft the next day. Consider, for instance, the treatment of dishonest merchants. A trader who tampered with weights might spend a day in the pillory, his false scales hung mockingly around his neck. This turned his very crime into a symbol, a visual representation of dishonesty. Likewise, bakers might be punished by being locked in with a loaf of underweight bread displayed for all to see. The lesson was clear. Your shame is now your identity. Everyone knows what you have done. Everyone will remember. This symbolic quality of humiliation extended beyond the pillory. Other punishments, such as forcing a person to wear signs declaring their crimes, were rooted in the same principle. But the pillory stood out because it immobilized the body and left the punished person utterly vulnerable. Vulnerability, in turn, magnified shame. It stripped away dignity, leaving the person no choice but to endure the gaze of others. Yet humiliation as punishment raises a deeper question. Why did communities believe shame worked? The answer lies partly in the structure of medieval life. Villages and towns were small, interconnected, and bound by necessity. You could not disappear into anonymity. Everyone knew who you were, what you did, and whom you wronged. To be humiliated was to risk losing the very social fabric that sustained you. Fear of the pillory, then, was not simply fear of pain or embarrassment, it was fear of exclusion. To be mocked and ridiculed publicly was to stand at the edge of the community, to feel for a moment what it might mean to be an outcast. And for most people, survival outside the community was unthinkable. Still, we must ask, was this system fair? Did humiliation truly correct behavior, or did it simply scar reputations beyond repair? For some, the pillory was a turning point, a harsh reminder that restored them to honest living. For others, it became a mark they never escaped, driving them further into desperation. The ambiguity of humiliation as a tool of order is what makes the pillory so fascinating. It was both corrective and destructive, both unifying and divisive. It reflected the power of rulers, but also revealed the power of the people, whose reactions could shape the meaning of the punishment. So, as you imagine once more the crowded square, the wooden frame, and the faces of townsfolk pressed close to watch, ask yourself, did the pillory strengthen the bonds of community through shared moral lessons, or did it fracture them by turning neighbors into participants in cruelty? By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern era, the pillory, once a familiar sight in town squares across Europe, began its slow decline. The wooden structure that had stood as a symbol of communal order for centuries gradually fell out of use, not because crime disappeared, but because society itself was changing. The world was becoming less communal, less rooted in the ever-watchful eye of the town square, and more dependent on centralized states, written law, and systems of punishment carried out in private. To understand this decline, imagine once more the square you visited before the busy marketplace, the stalls, the gossip, the sound of church bells. Now imagine that, over time, larger towns and growing cities begin to transform the way people live together. In small villages, where everyone knows everyone else, humiliation has power. But in a growing city, with its swelling populations and increasing anonymity, the sting of public shame is less effective. A person might leave one neighborhood and simply start over elsewhere. Authorities recognized this shift. The pillory, which relied on constant communal involvement, began to feel outdated in societies where justice was increasingly managed by bureaucracies and courts. By the 16th and 17th centuries, states sought punishments that could be standardized, controlled, and applied without relying on the unpredictable reactions of the crowd. After all, public humiliation sometimes backfired. There were countless cases where crowds sided with the accused, turning the pillory into a stage for defiance rather than obedience. Another factor was the changing idea of justice itself. In medieval society, justice was deeply theatrical. It was about showing order as much as maintaining it, about making wrongdoers visible examples. But as Enlightenment thinking spread across Europe, punishment began to shift toward ideas of correction, discipline, and reform. The spectacle of a man locked in wood while children jeered no longer seemed like justice to reformers who argued for more rational systems. The pillory began to look barbaric, even embarrassing, to emerging modern sensibilities, yet the decline was slow. In some places, pillories were still used well into the 18th century, and in parts of England, they survived until the 19th. Famous writers such as Daniel Defoe even experienced the pillory firsthand. In 1703, he was sentenced for writing a political pamphlet deemed seditious. But rather than being pelted with filth, he was showered with flowers by supporters. The punishment, intended to humiliate him, turned into a public display of defiance against the government. Such incidents demonstrated how the pillory could undermine authority, instead of reinforcing it. As society moved away from humiliation, other punishments took its place. Prisons expanded, offering a way to remove offenders from sight rather than parade them in public. Fines, too, became more common, especially as money replaced reputation as the key marker of survival and status. For more serious crimes, executions were still carried out, but even these began to shift from theatrical events to more regulated, eventually private, practices. By the time the pillory was officially abolished in England in 1837, it was already more a relic than a reality. Many towns had long since abandoned it, leaving their pillories to rot in disuse or stand silently as curiosities of another age. Some were dismantled entirely. Others remained in squares as historical reminders of a time when justice was a public performance. Today, a few still survive in European towns, not as instruments of humiliation, but as museum pieces, mute wooden frames that once held living Breathing people. The decline of the pillory reveals something deeper about the history of punishment. It is not simply about what was considered fair or cruel, but about how societies understood themselves. In a world where community was everything, shame was the sharpest tool. In a world moving toward individualism and state power, shame lost its edge. Justice no longer relied on the collective gaze of neighbors, but on the hidden mechanisms of law and authority. And yet, even in modern times, echoes of the pillory remain. Public shaming has not vanished. It has simply changed form. Today, it takes place less in town squares and more in newspapers, on television, or across digital screens. A scandal can still ruin a reputation, and humiliation remains a tool of social control. Lonely now. The crowd is global, and the pillory has no wooden frame, only words, images, and judgment. As you reflect on the decline of the pillory, ask yourself, was the transition to private punishment truly more humane? Or did society simply exchange one form of control for another, hiding its humiliations from view while continuing to rely on the fear of exposure? Story 2. Trial by Ordeal. God's Judgment in Fire and Water. Imagine yourself standing outside a medieval church on a gray morning. The bells toll, summoning villagers and townsfolk from every corner. They gather not for a feast, nor for worship, but for a trial. A man accused of theft stands before the priest and the magistrate, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the ground. He has denied the charge, but in a world where evidence is scarce and witnesses are uncertain, words alone are not enough. Justice must be proven another way. The people believe there is only one true judge of guilt or innocence, God. This belief gave rise to what we now call trial by ordeal. For centuries across Europe, men and women accused of crimes were subjected to strange and often dangerous tests, not because anyone thought the tests themselves revealed truth, but because they were believed to invite divine judgment. If God protected the accused during the ordeal, it was proof of innocence. If not, the outcome was considered just punishment. There were many forms of ordeal, each rooted in ritual and symbolism. Perhaps the most famous was the ordeal of hot iron. In this test, the accused was forced to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a set distance, often 3 or 4 paces. Afterward, their burned hand was bandaged, and 3 days later, the wound was inspected by a priest. If it had begun to heal cleanly, the person was declared innocent. If it festered or grew worse, guilt was proclaimed. Imagine the fear of extending your bare hand toward searing metal, knowing that your faten perhaps, your life depended on whether your skin blistered in a way the priest judged acceptable. Another ordeal was that of boiling water. The accused was ordered to plunge a hand, or, in some cases, an entire arm, into a cauldron of boiling liquid to retrieve a stone or ring placed at the bottom. Like the ordeal of hot iron, the healing of the burn determined guilt or innocence. The symbolism was clear. The hand that reached into the depths was a hand reaching for truth. Only a pure soul could emerge unscathed. Equally common was the ordeal of cold water, though it functioned differently. Here, the accused was bound and cast into a river or pond. To sink was considered a sign of innocence, for it meant the water had accepted them. To float was to be guilty, as if the water itself rejected their presence. At first glance, This may sound mercifully, yet consider the reality. Many who sank drowned before anyone could save them. Others who floated were dragged out, not to freedom, but to punishment. Their guilt confirmed. There were variations, too. Some faced the ordeal of fire, walking barefoot across burning plowshares. Others swore solemn oaths before holy relics, knowing that if they lied, divine wrath might strike them down in the days to come. These rituals blended fear, faith, and superstition into a single, dramatic performance of justice. What strikes you most, perhaps, is not the ordeal itself, but the way it was staged. Trials by ordeal were never private. They took place in public squares, in churchyards, or at the steps of a monastery, with villagers gathered close. They were ceremonies of faith as much as punishments. Priests chanted prayers, holy water was sprinkled, relics were displayed. Every step was designed to remind both the accused and the crowd that this was not merely human judgment but divine will revealed through human suffering. And so the ordeal became both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying, because the tests seemed impossible to survive without harm. Reassuring, because in a world of uncertainty, it offered clarity. People could look upon a wound and believe they saw God's verdict written in flesh. In a time when courts lacked evidence, when literacy was rare and records scarce, the ordeal filled a void. It gave communities a sense of certainty that human judgment alone could not provide. Yet behind the ceremony, questions linger. How often did the ordeal truly reveal guilt? Could it not be manipulated by priests who might bandage a wound loosely or tightly, depending on their sympathies? Did cold water ever truly accept one person and reject another? Or was it the simple science of buoyancy, misunderstood as divine will? For the medieval villagers gathered in that churchyard, these questions rarely surfaced. To them, the ordeal was a mystery, and mystery itself was proof of divine truth. If someone survived the fire or the boiling water, it was not skill or luck, it was God. If someone failed, it was not misfortune, it was judgment. But as you stand among that crowd, watching the accused lower his hand into scalding water, another thought arises. Did the ordeal serve justice, or did it serve fear? Was it truly about uncovering truth, or was it about reinforcing the power of the church and the community's shared belief in divine authority? By the 12th and 13th centuries, the ordeal, once seen as the most reliable form of divine justice, began to face growing criticism. At first, the changes were small local doubts, whispered suspicions, but gradually, the practice that had bound communities together for centuries began to unravel. The decline of trial by ordeal was not sudden, but rather a slow transformation, shaped by legal reform, theological debate, and the shifting structure of medieval society. One of the key turning points came from within the church itself. By the early 13th century, church leaders began questioning whether it was truly appropriate to use sacred rituals to expose guilt or innocence. In 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, the Church formally forbade priests from participating in ordeals. This decision was monumental, lost its sacred authority. What had once been seen as divine truth now looked more like dangerous superstition. But the decline was not only theological, it was also practical. Legal systems were becoming more sophisticated. Written records grew more common, and witnesses began to hold greater weight in courts. The ordeal, which relied on spectacle and ritual rather than reason or evidence, started to appear out of step with the needs of a society that was slowly centralizing its laws. Then rituals that relied on unpredictable outcomes and the reactions of crowds. Still, old habits die hard. In many villages, ordeals continued long after they were officially banned. Communities clung to them because they offered something that written law could not, a sense of divine presence in daily life. But only the ordeal carried the weight of God's judgment in the eyes of the people. For decades, and in some places, centuries, ordeals lingered in practice even as they vanished from official law in England. For example, the ordeal of water was used as late as the 17th century, especially in witch trials. Was sharpened. Those accused of witchcraft were thrown into water, which was believed to reject the guilty. To float was to be condemned. To sink was to be innocent, though often drowned in the process. This grim survival of the ordeal shows how deeply fear and superstition could outlast reform. Yet, as time went on, even these remnants disappeared. Courts increasingly relied on evidence, testimony, and, in some cases, early forms of jury trial. The ordeal, once central to communal justice, became a relic of a more fearful, more faith-driven world. What was once seen as sacred now looked irrational, even dangerous. And yet, the disappearance of ordeals raises a subtle question. Did their end make justice fairer, or simply different? And powerless, a chance to appeal to a higher authority beyond the reach of lords and magistrates. A peasant accused by a wealthy neighbor could trust that in theory God himself might intervene. With the end of ordeals, justice fell more firmly into the hands of human judges who were themselves fallible and often biased by wealth or influence. Today, we look back at ordeals with a mixture of horror and fascination. The image of a man holding red-hot iron ore being cast into water feels barbaric, almost unimaginable. And yet, when we reflect on the fear and uncertainty of medieval life, the ordeal makes a strange kind of sense. It was a way for ordinary people to believe that truth could be revealed, even in a world where evidence was scarce and power was unequal. The wooden pillory in the square, the hot iron in the churchyard, the cold water in the river were stages upon which faith and fear played out. They are gone now, replaced by prisons, courts, and documents. But the human longing for certainty, for a justice beyond mere human judgment, remains so. As you picture the last villagers watching an ordeal fade from use, ask yourself, did the decline of trial by ordeal represent progress toward reason and fairness, or did it mark the loss of a system in which people believed, however painfully, that divine justice could still reach into their daily lives? If the ordeal seems strange to you now, remember that in the medieval mind, faith was not separate from daily life. It was the lens through which everything was understood, whether health, fortune, and justice itself. To survive a trial by hot iron or boiling water was not merely luck. It was proof that God's hand had intervened. For villagers who lived in constant uncertainty, certain harvests, uncertain illnesses, uncertain dangers on the road, this belief offered comfort. It suggested that justice was never truly left to flawed human judgment, but was guided by divine will. Consider the fear that underlay such rituals. The medieval world was full of dangers that no one fully understood. Disease struck without warning, storms destroyed crops, and fires consumed whole towns. In the face of such uncertainty, ordeals gave structure. They transformed the unknowable into something knowable. The priest's blessing of water or iron assured the crowd that what they were about to witness was not chaos, but God's order. The Church played a central role in shaping and sustaining these practices. Priests blessed the water, consecrated the iron, and interpreted the results. Their authority rested not only on spiritual power, but also on their ability to manage fear. To doubt the ordeal was to doubt God Himself, and so most people accepted it, even when outcomes seemed harsh. The ritual bound communities together under the shared belief that higher powers watched over them and would not allow injustice to triumph. But superstition blended with faith in subtle ways. Villagers whispered of charms that might protect someone from the ordeal, herbs rubbed on the skin before carrying hot iron, or secret prayers muttered under the breath before stepping into boiling water. Some believed that holy relics, if touched or worn, could ensure survival. Whether these practices truly offered protection or simply gave courage, they reveal how deeply people sought any advantage when faced with the terrifying prospect of divine trial. Fear, too, served its own purpose. Even if few actually faced an ordeal, the knowledge that it existed deterred crime. Who would risk theft if they knew they might be forced to plunge a hand into boiling water? Who would tell lies in court if they feared being asked to swear before holy relics, risking divine wrath if they perjured themselves? The ordeal's power was not only in its execution, but in its reputation. Yet the ordeal was not always applied evenly. Much depended on status and circumstance. A wealthy landowner accused of wrongdoing might negotiate his way out of the ordeal, offering compensation instead. A poor peasant with no resources to bargain would have no such escape. The ordeal, then, was as much a reflection of social inequality as of divine will. Still, for those with no voice, no written contract, and no influence in court, it offered a strange kind of hope. Perhaps God would intervene where human judges might be. Swayed, the psychological weight of the ordeal cannot be overstated. Imagine standing before your neighbors, bound and trembling, knowing that in a few moments you must plunge your arm into searing water. The crowd watches in silence. The priest chants a prayer, his words echoing against the church walls. You lower your hand, and pain explodes across your skin. Whether guilty or innocent, the experience itself leaves a scar. For the accused, survival meant freedom, but also a lifelong reminder of that moment when God's judgment was believed to have touched their flesh. This intertwining of faith and fear shaped not only trials, but the way people thought about morality itself. The ordeal reinforced the belief that sins, even hidden ones, could not escape divine notice. If God could reveal guilt through fire or water, then surely no secret was safe. The community lived under the constant awareness that higher powers might expose wrongdoing at any time. In this sense, the ordeal functioned not only as punishment, but as moral instruction. And yet, cracks in this belief began to appear. Some questioned whether wounds truly revealed innocence or guilt. Others noticed that priests could influence outcomes, loosening a bandage to allow healing, or tightening it to ensure infection. Rumors spread of favoritism, corruption, or manipulation. These doubts did not overturn the system immediately, but they planted seeds of skepticism. For centuries, however, faith and fear were strong enough to sustain the ordeal. To villagers who had little control over their lives, it offered a rare certainty. No matter how murky human disputes might be, God would reveal the truth. But ask yourself this: was the ordeal truly about finding justice, or was it about reassuring a fearful society that someone, somewhere, was in control? Story 3. The Whip, the Brand, and the Mark of Shame. Picture a narrow medieval street, lined with timber-framed houses that lean so close together their upper stories nearly touch. At the center of the square stands another familiar structure, the whipping post. Unlike the pillory, which immobilized a person for mockery, the whipping post was designed for pain. A stout wooden stake, often scarred by years of use, it bore the weight of countless punishments delivered in full view of the town public. Costly and executions too extreme, whipping provided a middle ground, swift, memorable, and public. The offender would be tied to the post, stripped to the waist, and lashed with a leather whip or rod. Sometimes it was a set number of strokes, determined by local law. The practice sounds cruel, but to medieval townsfolk it was practical. Whipping was quick. It required no long imprisonment, no maintenance of a captive, and no drawn-out trial. It delivered visible consequences for wrongdoing, while also sparing the community the expense of caring for a prisoner. And, just as important, it offered a public lesson. As the whip cracked and the victim cried out, everyone watching was reminded of the cost of disobedience. Whipping was not confined to adults. Children, too, were subject to the lash, both in homes and in schools. Discipline was thought to be inseparable from pain, and the rod was considered a necessary tool for shaping obedience. The phrase, "spare the rod and spoil the child," carried more than symbolic weight. It was lived reality. To be struck was not seen as extraordinary, but as part of everyday discipline. But the whipping post in the town square carried a different weight. Here, the act was not private correction, but communal justice. The crowd gathered as the offender was brought forward, bound and stripped. The executioner or appointed officer raised the whip, and with each stroke the crack echoed against stone walls. Blood might flow, skin might break, but the crowd's attention was not only on the pain. Justice was being done, and order reaffirmed. The spectacle could draw mixed reactions. Some citizens jeered, urging the officer to strike harder, while others winced in silence, uneasy with the sight. Yet almost all watched, for the whipping was as much a part of public life as the market or the church service. Children perched on doorsteps, learning through fear. The whip sang not just across the skin of the punished, but across the collective imagination of the town. Whipping varied in intensity, or begging, while a merchant of some standing could often bribe officials for a lighter sentence or avoid the whip entirely. The punishment revealed, as much as enforced, the inequalities of medieval justice. Still, for many, the whip was inescapable. Traveling offenders often endured the most humiliating form, the whipping tour. Instead of receiving punishment in a single square, they were marched from one end of town to the other, lashed at each stop so that every neighborhood could witness their disgrace. The journey left not only wounds, but also a trail of memory. Everyone who saw them would remember the day, The whip sang through the streets, and whipping was not confined to towns. In rural villages, offenders might be tied to a tree or post. Outside the church, punished before the eyes of neighbors they saw every day. For those who lived close together in small communities, the memory of such a public lashing lingered for years, a mark as lasting as any scar. What makes whipping most striking in the history of punishment is its ordinariness. Unlike execution, which was rare, whipping was routine. It was a tool of governance, discipline, and instruction, used so often that its sound became part of the background of medieval life. And yet, one must wonder, did the whip truly correct behavior, or did it simply instill fear? Did those who were lashed resolve to live honestly, or did they carry resentment and humiliation that pushed them further from the community? If whipping was meant to sting in the moment, branding was meant to last a lifetime. Where the whip's scars might fade, the brand declared guilt forever. A hot iron pressed against flesh left a mark that could not be hidden, letter A, symbol, or a burn that immediately told anyone who saw it that this person had transgressed. Branding was not invented in medieval Europe. The practice stretched back to antiquity, with slaves in Rome sometimes branded on the forehead to indicate their status, and criminals in Greece marked so they could not escape recognition. But medieval societies adapted the method to their own needs, weaving it into the fabric of justice, humiliation, and deterrence. In England, thieves might receive a T on the thumb for thief. In France, a fleur-de-lis could be burned into the shoulder, symbolizing both shame and the authority of the crown. In Germany, marks varied by region, sometimes initials, sometimes abstract symbols. The key point was that the branded body became a walking record of wrongdoing. Even if the criminal traveled to a new town, the scar gave them away. The branding itself was ritualized. A blacksmith's iron ore, a specially crafted letter-shaped brand, was heated in a fire until glowing red. The condemned was restrained at the pillory, sometimes tied to a post. Then, in front of onlookers, the executioner pressed the searing metal against flesh. The sound of burning skin, the sharp smell that filled the air, and the cry of pain were as much a part of the punishment as the mark itself. The mark was usually placed where it could not be hidden: the face, the forehead, the hand. Later, as cloth fashions shifted, some courts chose the shoulder or arm, ensuring that if the branded criminal removed clothing in public, the scar would reveal itself. Unlike whipping, which was a public event that ended with the day, branding followed. The condemned everywhere, the permanent mark functioned as both punishment and warning. For the criminal, it meant shame, rejection, and loss of opportunities. Employers, guilds, and communities could see at once that the branded person was untrustworthy. For society, it reinforced order by turning the offender into a living, cautionary tale. Yet branding also had unintended consequences. A thief branded with a T could rarely escape suspicion even if they truly reformed. Branded beggars might find no one willing to give them food or work, forcing them into further crime simply to survive. Instead of rehabilitation, branding often deepened the cycle of criminality. And there were nuances, too. In some cases, branding was seen as preferable to harsher sentences. To be branded but spared, the gallows could be counted as fortune. Some criminals even viewed it as a grim badge of survival. Better to live branded than not at all. Not all branding was done with fire. Some regions practiced cold branding, where a sharp tool carved a mark into the skin, leaving a scar without burning. Others tattooed criminals with ink or dye. The goal was always the same: permanence. Over time, branding came to serve not only as punishment but as record-keeping. Offenders could be recognized at once. A thief with one brand might be fined, but a thief with 2 or 3 could face execution. The skin, in effect, became a legal archive, carrying the person's history in scars. Of course, some attempted to hide the marks. Scarves, gloves, or elaborate hairstyles might cover them. Others sought folk remedies, salves, poultices, or even surgery to lessen the scars. But the success of these efforts was limited, and suspicion lingered. If someone wore gloves too often or kept their head covered indoors, people wondered what shame they were concealing. The practice also reflected deeper medieval ideas about the body and sin. To brand someone was not just to punish the flesh, but to reveal the soul. The mark was thought to externalize inner corruption, displaying it to the world. In that sense, branding was less about the crime itself and more about the enduring moral stain attached to it. And yet, the cruelty of branding raises a question. Did it truly protect society by making wrongdoers visible, or did it merely isolate them further, pushing them to the margins with no way back? Was the mark of shame a tool of order war, a sentence to perpetual exclusion? If whipping and branding were instruments of fear, they were also the tools of a specialized figure, the executioner. This man sometimes feared, sometimes despised, occasionally even respected, was the one who carried out the punishments that others decreed. The executioner's duties were varied. He might hang a thief one day, break a wheel on a murderer the next, and administer whippings and brandings in between. The role demanded skill not only in taking lives, but in inflicting controlled pain. Whipping too lightly made justice seem weak, too harshly, and the condemned might die before sentence was complete. Branding too clumsily left scars unreadable. The punishment had to be exact, precise, and unmistakable. Executioners lived at the edge of society. Their work was necessary, yet many believed it tainted. Neighbors might refuse to eat with them or marry into their families. Their homes were often near the gallows or outside the town walls. Children inherited the stigma of their fathers. Trade. And yet, when punishments were needed, the community turned to them. The paradox was unavoidable, despised and indispensable. They became symbols of the justice system itself. Corporal punishment also functioned as public theater. Market, squares, churchyards, and crossroads became stages where crime and consequence were displayed. Crowds gathered not just to see the punishment, but to participate in it. Some jeered, others pitied. In certain towns, bystanders were encouraged to throw refuse at the condemned as they were whipped. In others, silence was demanded, making the crack of the whip or hiss of the brand stand out in the air. For the punished, the memory of the event often lasted longer than the physical pain. Diaries, court records, and folk songs tell of criminals who remembered not only the blows or the burn, but the humiliation, the stares of neighbors, the feeling of being bound, the knowledge that one's body had been turned into a spectacle. These scars of memory could weigh heavier than scars of flesh. Yet by the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, cracks began to appear in the system. Philosophers, jurists, and even monarchs questioned whether such punishments served justice or merely cruelty. The growth of towns made public punishments more disruptive. Rising literacy encouraged new ways of recording crime through written documents rather than marks on the body. Slowly, branding and whipping began to decline. By the 18th century, prison sentences, fines, and transportation sending convicts overseas, often to colonies, increasingly replaced corporal punishments. Reformers argued that society gained. Branding, in particular, came to be seen as outdated, a relic of a harsher age. By the 19th century, it had largely disappeared from Europe, though traces lingered in colonial systems. And yet, the memory of these punishments lingers. Even now, when we speak of someone bearing the mark of guilt or scars of the past, we echo a medieval world where flesh and shame were intertwined. The whip and the brand shaped not only bodies, but the language of justice itself. Perhaps that is the real legacy, not the scars left on individual criminals, but the reminder that societies once inscribed punishment directly onto the skin, believing. And if punishment today is less visible, confined to prisons, sealed in court records, does that mean we have grown more humane, or have we simply hidden the spectacle from view? Story 4. The Cucking Stool. Punishing gossip and quarreling women. If branding marked the body and whipping broke the skin, the cucking stool worked differently. It was not a tool of pain so much as a device of humiliation. Imagine a wooden chair, sometimes ordinary, sometimes reinforced with iron, fixed on a long beam or set upon wheels. A woman convicted of gossiping, scolding, or causing domestic disturbance would be strapped into it, paraded through the town, and often dunked in water before laughing crowds. The punishment was not medieval Europe's invention alone. Roots of the practice can be traced to early Anglo-Saxon laws, where scolds women accused of disturbing the peace with their tongues were fined or punished in communal ways. Over time, the chair became the most common symbol of this offense. Its very shape said something. Ordinary enough to remind the victim of domestic life, but transformed into an object of ridicule by its public use. Why gossip? Why scolding? In a world where survival depended on neighborly cooperation, the spoken word carried weight. Markets, fields, and churches were held together by trust. A woman accused of spreading lies, sowing discord, or quarreling with neighbors could be seen as a danger to social order. Men, too, could be punished, though records suggest that women bore the brunt. Gender expectations shaped the offense. Women were expected to be silent, obedient, and moderate, and those who broke that mold became easy targets. The cucking stool, therefore, was less about crime in the modern sense and more about social conformity. It was a way for communities to discipline women whose behavior challenged norms. Punishment could be requested by neighbors, decided by manorial courts, or decreed by town officials. The offense might seem smaller, sharp tongue, a heated quarrel, or a public insult, but the consequences could be very visible. Often, the stool was placed on wheels and rolled through the streets, with the punished woman forced to endure from neighbors. In some towns, the chair was attached to a long beam set on a pivot above a river or pond. Here, the punishment became more physical. The victim was dunked repeatedly in the water, soaked and shivering, to the amusement of onlookers. The act symbolized cooling the heated temper as if water itself could wash away gossip and anger. We might think of this as comic, almost farcical, but for the women bound in the chair, it was anything but. The humiliation could stain reputations for years. In communities where everyone knew one another, being paraded as a scold made it harder to trade, marry, or even be heard with credibility. The punishment was not just a moment of laughter for neighbors, it was a lasting mark on someone's social standing. Surviving records from England, Scotland, and Germany suggest that the practice was most common between the 14th and 17th centuries. Local variations abounded. In some towns, men who engaged in brawling or fraudulent trading also found themselves on the stool, but overwhelmingly it remained linked to disciplining women. The stool reveals much about medieval and early modern justice. It was not about prisons or lengthy trials, but about visible correction staged for the community. It was, in essence, a reminder that justice was not just in the hands of officials, but in the shared gaze of neighbors. And yet, one has to wonder, did the cucking stool really silence gossip? Or did it, instead, provide another story for people to whisper about at market stalls and hearths? Another tale of shame that spread precisely because tongues could not be restrained. When we picture the cucking stool, it is easy to imagine the object itself, a crude wooden chair strapped to a beam, sometimes iron-rimmed to keep its occupant fixed in place. But the real power of the stool lay not in the wood or the water, but in the ritual of its use. This was not a private punishment delivered in silence. It was a public spectacle designed for maximum visibility. The process often began with a formal complaint. Neighbors, weary of someone's sharp words or frequent quarrels, might bring the matter before the local court. In manorial records, these cases appear with formulaic descriptions: for being a common scold, for sowing discord among neighbors, or for disturbing the peace. The offense could be maddeningly vague. Almost anyone could accuse a woman of being a scold, and once the label stuck, defending oneself was difficult. Once judgment was passed, preparations began. The stool might be kept at the town hall or near the stocks, ready for use. In river towns, a special beam was sometimes fixed permanently to a bridge or wharf, with the chair dangling from its end like an ominous reminder of what awaited the unruly. In smaller villages, where resources were fewer, a makeshift version, a stool tied to a cart, dragged through muddy streets, served just as well. The humiliation began long before the first dunk. Strapped in place, the condemned woman was paraded through the streets. Her neighbors, perhaps the very people whose complaints had secured her punishment, lined the route. Children jeered, men made crude jokes, women whispered in clusters. It was not simply about seeing the offender punished. It was about affirming the community's shared authority to define what was acceptable. When the procession reached its climax at the riverbank or pond, the victim's ordeal became physical. The chair, attached to a pivoting beam, was swung outward and lowered into the water. Sometimes the woman was fully submerged, sometimes only splashed. Either way, the symbolism was clear. She was being cooled down. If her tongue had been too hot, too sharp, the chill of water would correct it. Accounts vary on how many times the dunking was repeated. Some ordinances specified 3 immersions, others left it to the officials or the crowd. In harsh weather, the punishment could be physically dangerous. There are records of women drowning, though most likely unintentionally. But even when no lives were lost, the shock of cold, the struggle to breathe, and the choking panic of water made the punishment more than symbolic. Equally important was what happened afterward. Dripping wet, shivering, sometimes bruised from the force of dunking, the woman was returned to her home, left to make her own way through streets where everyone had witnessed her shame. The laughter and gossip often continued long after the punishment ended. For days, weeks, or even years, she might be remembered as the woman who sat the stool. Case records help us glimpse the lived experience behind the ritual. In 1562, a woman in Kingston upon Thames was punished for being a common scold. Her cucking stool was wheeled to the Thames, and she was plunged 3 times into the river. In another case, from the town of Leominster, a woman named Margaret was sentenced after being accused by her neighbors of unreasonable words, though no precise record survives of her dunking. The sentence was noted with grim efficiency in the local rolls. Sometimes the punishment was adapted to circumstance. In towns without accessible water, the stool might be used as a stationary humiliation set in the market square for all to see. In such cases, the humiliation came not from soaking, but from exposure hours of sitting, restrained as the town went about its business around her. What is striking is the ritual's dual nature, both playful and cruel. The dunking could be accompanied by laughter, music, or mocking songs, turning punishment into entertainment. Yet beneath the farce lay very real consequences. Women who endured the stool lost standing in their communities, and some may have struggled to recover reputations afterward. And so, the stool reveals more than just medieval justice. It reveals how ordinary people participated in discipline. Unlike a royal executioner's axe or a knight's battlefield sword, the cucking stool was rooted in community power. Neighbors brought the complaint. Neighbors witnessed the punishment. Neighbors carried forward the memory of shame. The stool was as much about enforcing conformity as it was about silencing one woman's voice. But if humiliation was the aim, one cannot help but wonder how many of those dunked into rivers or paraded on carts later sat at their hearths, drying off, muttering curses under their breath and perhaps plotting the sharpest, most unforgettable words yet. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the cucking stool began to lose its prominence. Changing ideas about justice, the growing influence of centralized courts, and shifting views of women's roles meant that the stool, once common in towns across England and parts of Europe, started to fade into the background of history. Still, for centuries after, the memory of the stool lingered. In some towns, the physical structures remained in place, even as their use dwindled. Old records mention stools still standing by riversides, not as active tools of punishment, but as relics, decaying quietly. Occasionally, they were dusted off, for a ceremonial use, more as tradition than justice. The decline of the stool was not sudden. In some places, it was replaced by alternative punishments. Fines became increasingly common. Instead of being strapped into a wooden chair, a woman might be forced to pay a sum of money for unruly words. In other places, the scolds, bridle, or gossips, Branken iron cage, placed over the head with a tongue clamped, took its place as a symbol of silenced speech. The brunk was harsher in some ways, more invasive, but it did not require the spectacle of a chair, a river, and an assembled crowd. The stools fading also reflected wider changes in law and society. By the 18th century, the justice system was becoming less localized. Manorial courts, which had once enforced small-scale communal discipline, declined. Towns and cities increasingly turned to centralized authority, where punishments were codified and managed with less room for spontaneous rituals of humiliation. In such a system, the stool, so dependent on community participation and local spectacle, felt out of place. And yet, while the physical dunkings ended, the cultural memory persisted. The phrase "to be put on the cucking stool" continued to appear in literature and conversation long after the device itself had rotted away. It became shorthand for female humiliation, for being silenced or mocked by one's neighbors. The stool survived as a symbol, even when it no longer functioned as a punishment. Curiously, the stool also began to be remembered with a kind of nostalgia. By the 19th century, antiquarians, those passionate collectors of relics and curiosities, rescued old cucking stools from barns or cellars, placing them in museums. Visitors gazed upon them as quaint oddities, reminders of merrier times when punishment was a community affair. The crueler realities were softened into historical curiosity. But what the stool really reveals is something far deeper about society: the enduring power of shame. Public humiliation did not vanish with the decline of the cucking stool. It simply took new forms. The gossip, silenced by water in the 17th century, had her modern counterpart in the individual shamed by rumor, ridicule, or ostracism in later centuries. Shame remained a weapon, even if the wooden chair was no longer needed. There is also the question of resistance. While official records show the punishments delivered, they rarely tell us what happened afterward. Did some women shrug it off, laughing at the absurdity of neighbors who feared their sharp words? Did others leave their communities unable to bear the stigma? Were some emboldened, their anger deepened rather than diminished? History rarely records these reactions, but human experience suggests they were many and varied. It is tempting to see the stool as only a relic of gendered injustice, but its lessons extend further. The stool shows how communities once believed discipline belonged to everyone, not just distant kings or officials. Neighbors were both the accusers and the audience. The punishment was as much about reinforcing communal identity as about silencing one individual. To understand the stool is to understand the everyday power of belonging and the costs of falling outside it. Today, when we look back at the cucking stool, it is easy to shake our heads at the cruelty or absurdity of such punishment. Yet, in subtler ways, echoes of the stool remain with us. Social ridicule, public exposure, and the weaponization of gossip still shape reputations and silence voices. The wooden chair may be gone, but the impulse to humiliate in the name of order remains deeply human. And so, as the last stools gathered dust in forgotten corners of market towns, one cannot help but wonder, were they relics of cruelty, finally abandoned, or symbols of a deeper truth that shame, once institutionalized in wood and water, would never truly disappear from human society? Story 5: Trial by Ordeal, Fire, Water, and the Judgment of God. Imagine yourself in a small medieval village, standing in the churchyard as bells toll slowly in the cool morning air. A crowd has gathered, not for a festival, not for a wedding, but for judgment. Before them stands a man accused of theft, his fate to be decided not by witnesses or jurors, but by ordeal, by the hands of God himself. The medieval world was one of faith interwoven with fear. Law, justice, and religion were inseparable. To be accused of a crime was not merely to offend against one's neighbor. It was to offend against divine order. And so, when human evidence was scarce, people turned to God to decide. If God ruled the heavens, surely he would not let the innocent suffer unjustly. Thus, the trial by ordeal was born. Origins and beliefs. The ordeal has deep roots, older than the medieval period itself. In early Germanic law, communities often believed that the gods would protect the innocent through physical tests. This belief survived the spread of Christianity, reshaped but never entirely abandoned. By the 9th and 10th centuries, trial by ordeal had become woven into the fabric of European justice. The logic was simple, yet terrifying. When evidence was lacking, or when disputes could not be resolved, the accused was subjected to a dangerous test. If they emerged unharmed, they were declared innocent. If they suffered or failed, guilt was assumed. To modern eyes, these trials seem absurdly unfair. Yet, in the mindset of the time, they were the ultimate test, one beyond corruption, beyond bias, entrusted to divine will. Common forms of ordeal. The ordeal came in several varieties, each with its own grim ritual. The ordeal of hot iron, perhaps the most infamous. This test required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for a set number of paces. Their hand would then be bandaged, sealed, and examined days later. If the wound showed signs of healing, innocence was declared. If infection festered, guilt was proven. The ordeal of boiling water. In this test, a stone or ring was thrown into a cauldron of boiling water. The accused had to plunge their arm in to retrieve it. As with the iron, the injury was inspected days later for signs of divine favor. The ordeal of cold water. Here, the accused was bound and cast into a body of water. If they floated, they were deemed guilty, for the pure water of baptism was believed to reject the sinner. If they sank, innocence was assumed, though one hoped. They were pulled out before drowning. The ordeal of the cross, less brutal, but still intense. This required two parties to stand before a cross with arms outstretched. The first to lower their arms lost the case. As though God had decided, endurance reflected righteousness. Each form carried the same underlying belief. God's justice could not be fooled. No bribe could sway the hot iron. No clever words could change the boiling water. No trick could convince the sacred pool to reject or accept a body unfairly. The role of the church. It is important to understand that ordeals were not simply barbaric punishments inflicted by vengeful lords. They were deeply religious ceremonies, often conducted within or beside a church. Priests blessed the iron, consecrated the water, and prayed that God would reveal the truth. The ordeal was not a separate act from worship, it was a continuation of it. For the medieval mind, this was not cruelty, but fairness. A human judge might err, a witness might lie, but God, working through fire, water, or endurance, could not be deceived. That belief gave ordeals their power, and communities accepted them not as strange, but as sacred. The social function of ordeal beyond belief in divine justice. Ordeals served an important social function. They provided a way to resolve disputes when no other resolution was possible. Without written records, forensic evidence, or formal trials, communities needed a tool that carried authority. An ordeal gave closure. Once completed, the result was accepted by all, and perhaps, in a sense, ordeals worked not because God intervened, but because the rituals themselves were powerful. The solemn blessing of the iron, the prayers, the gathering of neighbors all lent weight to the verdict. People left convinced that justice had been done. Whether the outcome was healing or harm, a subtle reality yet, one must ask, how often did ordeals truly hurt the accused? Some historians suggest that priests sometimes manipulated the process. A hot iron might be cooler than expected. A boiling cauldron might be allowed to cool just enough. A bandage might be applied with care to encourage healing. If the priest or community believed in the innocence of the accused, they may have helped ensure a favorable outcome. This makes the ordeal a more complicated phenomenon than it first appears. It was not always a mindless act of cruelty. It was also a flexible ritual, one that could be bent to mercy when mercy seemed right. A community watching. Imagine the scene again, the bells ringing, the villagers gathered, the priest murmuring prayers. The accused steps forward, trembling but resolute, to take the iron ore, plunge into the water. All eyes are upon them. Children whisper, neighbors cross themselves. The silence is heavy with expectation. It is not merely the accused on trial. The whole community is being reminded that order depends on faith, that God watches, that justice is divine, and that no one can escape the judgment of heaven. But what happens when belief wavers? What happens when doubts creep in, when people begin to wonder whether God's hand truly guides the iron, or whether wounds heal simply because that is what bodies do? The practice of ordeal was not confined to obscure villages or forgotten hamlets. It reached into courts, abbeys, and royal chambers. From peasants accused of theft to queens accused of treason, ordeals became a central, unnerving pillar of medieval justice. Ordeals in the royal courts. One of the most famous examples of ordeal occurred in the 11th century, involving Queen Emma of Normandy, the mother of King Edward, the Confessor of England. She was accused of impropriety and even conspiracy against her son. The charges were grave, and no ordinary trial could suffice. Emma was subjected to an ordeal by fire. She had to walk across red-hot plowshares laid out on the ground. According to the chroniclers, she passed through without harm, proving her innocence. To the people of the time, this was no small matter. The Queen Mother herself had been tried by fire, and God had shown her innocence. To later generations, the story reads like legend, but to contemporaries, it reinforced the idea that no one, however high, was beyond the reach of divine justice. Ordeals in local disputes for ordinary people. Ordeals were less grand, but equally decisive. A farmer accused of stealing grain might face the boiling cauldron. A woman accused of witchcraft might be thrown into cold water. These were not isolated incidents. They were woven into the legal customs of entire regions. In Germany, France, and England, ordeals became so routine that guides were written for priests, detailing the proper prayers and rituals. The records that survive show not only the ordeals themselves, but also their acceptance by society. Rarely do we find complaints in the early centuries. villagers truly believed the process revealed the truth. When a thief's wounds festered, it was clear evidence of guilt. When a suspect's hand healed cleanly, it was seen as divine vindication. The ordeal of cold water and witchcraft, of all the ordeals, none has gained more notoriety than the ordeal of cold water. Later, in the witch trials of early modern Europe, this ritual took on a sinister life of its own. The accused, bound and cast into a pond, was believed guilty if they floated, innocent if they sank. This cruel logic stemmed from the belief that water, made holy through baptism, would reject the sinful. Yet, even in the Middle Ages, this ordeal was used sparingly. Too many times, the innocent drowned before they could be rescued, and yet the symbolism of the act endured, resurfacing centuries later in the hysteria of witch hunting. The clergy's involvement, what strikes modern readers as peculiar is the church's role. Priests did not shy away from ordeals, they oversaw them. In fact, they were considered essential. Without sacred blessing, the iron was simply iron, and the water merely water. With a priest's words, however, they became channels for God's judgment. But this deep involvement created problems. The church was supposed to care for souls, not risk them in boiling cauldrons. Some clerics themselves began to question whether such tests truly reflected divine will. Could one really claim that infection or lack thereof was God's direct judgment? Or were these trials a blend of faith, fear, and human manipulation? Growing skepticism by the 12th century, doubts were spreading. Thinkers such as Peter, Abelard, and other scholastics questioned the theological foundation of ordeals. Did God truly intervene in every case? Was it not presumption to demand his judgment through fire or water? Even if one accepted that miracles occurred, could one expect them on command? Civil rulers, too, began to see flaws. A system that relied on dangerous rituals was costly, unpredictable, and sometimes politically inconvenient. A noble declared guilty through ordeal could destabilize entire regions. And while villagers might accept the verdict, rulers often found themselves entangled in disputes when outcomes seemed unjust. Famous cases of manipulation. There are stories whispered in chronicles of priests tilting the scales. An iron that should have been red hot might be allowed to cool. A cauldron might not boil as fiercely as expected. A bandage might be wrapped with herbs to speed healing. In these cases, the ordeal was less about divine intervention and more about community consensus. If the accused was beloved, their ordeal might be merciful. If they were despised, no such leniency was offered. This reveals a quiet truth. Ordeals, despite their religious trappings, were profoundly human affairs. They worked not because God's hand moved visibly, but because people believed he did. The ritual itself created closure, no matter the outcome. A turning point, the 12th and 13th centuries marked a shift. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most significant gatherings of church leaders in history, formally forbade priests from participating in ordeals. Without the blessing of clergy, the rituals lost much of their power. What was the hot iron without a priest's prayer? What was the boiling cauldron without consecration? This decision marked the beginning of the end. Over the next century, ordeals slowly disappeared from European courts, replaced by jury trials and written records. The age of divine judgment through fire and water was closing, yet not entirely gone still. The memory of ordeals lingered. Communities that had long relied on them were reluctant to abandon the practice. In some rural areas, ordeals continued unofficially. Even as legal systems modernized, people clung to the old ways, finding comfort in rituals that seemed more trustworthy than distant bureaucracies. And in cultural memory, ordeals never truly vanished. They became the stuff of legend and folklore, haunting stories of witches, saints, and sinners, even today. The idea of trial by fire or being thrown into the deep end echoes the medieval logic of ordeal. The question that remained, but here lies the deeper puzzle. Were ordeals ever about truth, or were they about belief? Did people truly expect God to intervene, or was the ordeal simply a tool to reinforce social order? The chroniclers tell us stories of miracles and clear judgments, but history suggests something subtler. Ordeals succeeded not because they revealed guilt or innocence, but because communities needed to believe they did. And so we are left to wonder if ordeals ended not because they failed, but because people stopped believing in them. What does that say about the nature of justice itself? By the early 13th century, the long age of ordeals had begun to fade, though the echoes of their practice continued to shape law, faith, and folklore for centuries. The decision of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 to ban clergy from participating in ordeals marked a profound turning point. Without priests to consecrate the water, bless the fire, or oversee the ritual, the very foundation of ordeal collapsed. Yet, its disappearance was neither swift nor complete. It lingered, slowly transforming into other forms of judgment and cultural memory. The gradual disappearance, after 1215, many secular rulers had little choice but to adjust. In England, King Henry III moved to strengthen the system of jury trials, which had already been developing under his predecessors. Instead of calling upon divine fire or boiling water, communities began to summon panels of menaburs, freemen, or respected landholders who would swear an oath to speak truth. This shift did not happen overnight, but as ordeal rituals fell out of practice, juries filled the vacuum. On the continent, especially in France and the German states, written records became more prominent. Charters, contracts, and testimony were increasingly valued as sources of truth. Law was moving, slowly but surely, toward rational procedures that could be documented and checked, rather than rituals that relied on faith and chance. Yet in some rural areas, ordeals continued. Chronicles mention communities still throwing accused thieves into rivers or compelling them to carry iron. These were unofficial, sometimes illegal, but they reveal how deeply ingrained the practice was. For villagers who distrusted distant courts, ordeal felt more immediate, more honest, and somehow more divine. The shadow of witchcraft, even though the church forbade ordeals, the logic of divine testing re-emerged in darker ways during the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. The ordeal of cold water, once rare, became infamous. Judges and inquisitors, desperate to prove guilt, revived the practice. Accused witches were bound and cast into ponds, with floating deemed proof of guilt. This cruel parody of medieval ordeal was not, strictly speaking, a continuation. It had been reinvented under new anxieties about witchcraft and heresy. But the symbolism was the same: water as judge, nature itself as the voice of God. The irony was bitter. A ritual once meant to resolve disputes in village courts had been weaponized into mass persecution. Ordeals beyond Europe. Interestingly, ordeals were not uniquely European. Across the globe, cultures devised similar rituals. In parts of India, accused persons drank poison or walked through fire to prove innocence. In West Africa, ordeals involved consuming toxic substances that were believed to reveal guilt or truth through survival. This parallel development suggests something universal in societies where forensic evidence did not exist. Ordeals provided a way to resolve conflict. They gave communities closure, even if the outcomes were arbitrary. Whether in medieval France or a distant kingdom, ordeal served the same function, transforming uncertainty into certainty, not through fact, but through shared belief. Ordeal, as theater of justice. Historians today often describe ordeals not as genuine trials, but as performances. The ritual itself, public, sacred, and dramatic, was more important than the outcome. Everyone gathered to see the accused tested, and everyone left believing that truth had been revealed. The act bound the community together, reaffirming faith in divine justice. Seen this way, ordeal was less about crime and more about order. It reinforced hierarchies, punished those who threatened stability, and reassured the faithful that God was watching. The success of ordeals lay not in their accuracy, but in their ability to maintain peace. Why they ended? If ordeals functioned so well as community rituals, why did they end? The answer lies in a combination of factors. Theological doubts. Church leaders increasingly feared that demanding God's judgment was a form of presumption. Practical dangers. Too many innocents suffered injury or death. Legal evolution. As bureaucracies grew, rulers preferred written procedures and jury verdicts. Shifting faith. A more scholastic, rational Christianity was emerging, less reliant on miracles and more on reason. By the late Middle Ages, ordeals were fading into memory, though never entirely gone from folk practice. The legacy of ordeals. After their official abolition, ordeals left a long cultural imprint. Language. We still speak of trial by fire or ordeal to describe difficult tests. Folklore. Tales of saints enduring ordeals as proof of holiness became popular. In Hegel, legal echoes, the emphasis on symbolic rituals in justice. Systems such as oaths on holy books, something to ordeals, fusion of law and faith. Perhaps most importantly, ordeals remind us how justice is always shaped by belief. In medieval Europe, the belief was that God would intervene. Today, the belief lies in forensic science, paperwork, and juries. Both systems serve the same purpose: transforming uncertainty into verdicts. Reflection. Looking back, it is easy to dismiss ordeals as cruel superstitions. Yet, for centuries, they brought closure to disputes, reassured communities, and reflected a worldview in which the divine was present in every aspect of life. The ordeal was, in its own way, an attempt to make the invisible visible, to let God speak through fire and water. And so we might ask, centuries from now, will our own methods of justice, our reliance on evidence, laboratories, and trials be seen as equally strange, equally flawed? If ordeals tell us anything, it is that justice is less about truth itself than about what societies need to believe in order to keep moving forward. You've been listening to Boring Past Times, where the forgotten corners of history find their quiet voice once more. From ordeals of fire and water to punishments carved into law, these stories remind us that the past is never truly gone. It lingers in whispers, waiting to be remembered. Until next time, may your dreams be calm and your history boring.